It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. I, Alex Carter, had been working endless nights at my marketing job and desperately needed a break. When my friend, Jake, suggested a camping trip to Clear Lake National Park, I hesitated. The idea of disconnecting from emails and deadlines sounded appealing, but I wasn't a nature person. Yet, something about the way Jake described the serene lake and starry skies convinced me to join. We set out on a Friday afternoon, Jake driving his trusty old truck while blasting his usual playlist of 80s rock. The drive was uneventful, the rolling hills and sparse towns giving way to thick forests. We arrived at the campsite just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The crimson sky reflected on the lake's surface, creating a surreal, almost painting-like scene. Little did I know, this trip would be anything but peaceful. The campsite was eerily quiet. Clear Lake was known for being a less touristy spot, but it felt abandoned. Jake, always the optimist, shrugged it off, saying it was a bonus to have the place to ourselves. We set up our tents near the edge of the lake, the water gently lapping at the shore. As we gathered wood for a fire, I noticed something strange, a second, empty campsite a few yards away. A tent was pitched, and an extinguished campfire sat in the middle, surrounded by folding chairs. "Looks like someone left in a hurry," I muttered. Jake glanced over, his brow furrowing. "Yeah, weird. But maybe they just went hiking or something." We didn't think much of it and returned to our fire. Night fell, and the forest around us came alive with the sounds of crickets and distant owl calls. Yet, there was something unsettling about the silence from the empty campsite. Around 10 p.m., as Jake and I exchanged stories over beers, a figure emerged from the trees. The firelight barely illuminated him, a tall man in a heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat. His face was partially shadowed, but his eyes glinted like steel in the firelight. "Evening," he said in a gravelly voice. "Hey there," Jake replied, ever the friendly one. "Out here camping too?" The man nodded, his movements slow and deliberate. "You could say that. Just passing through." His voice carried a weight that made my skin crawl. "Care to join us for a beer?" Jake offered, gesturing to the cooler. The man declined with a slight shake of his head. "Appreciate it, but I've got to keep moving. Just wanted to warn you, storm's coming. Best pack up by morning." With that, he disappeared back into the woods, leaving Jake and me exchanging uneasy glances. The promised storm arrived in the dead of night. I woke to the sound of howling wind and rain pelting the tent. The lake, once serene, churned violently, waves crashing against the shore. Jake and I huddled in our tents, waiting for the storm to pass. At some point, I heard it, a faint whispering outside. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone murmuring just beyond the tent flap. My heart pounded as I clutched the flashlight, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. By morning, the storm had subsided, but something felt off. The air was heavy, almost oppressive. Jake seemed unfazed as we prepared breakfast, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. Later that day, we decided to explore the area, hoping to shake off the unease. We stumbled upon a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. Jake, ever the adventurer, insisted we follow it. The trail ended at an old, dilapidated cabin. Its wooden walls were weathered and overgrown with moss. A no trespassing sign hung crookedly on the door. Despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back, Jake pushed open the door. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. A single table stood in the center, covered in old maps and notebooks. One notebook caught my eye. Its pages were filled with erratic handwriting, accounts of people disappearing near the lake, strange lights in the woods, and whispers in the night. "This is messed up," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake shrugged. "Probably just some conspiracy nut." But as we left the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being followed. That evening, the sense of unease reached a crescendo. The lake, once calming, seemed sinister under the pale moonlight. Shadows danced on the water, and the surrounding woods felt alive, watching. Jake fell asleep quickly, but I lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling. Around midnight, the whispers returned, closer, clearer. They weren't in my head this time. I unzipped the tent and peered out. Standing at the edge of the lake was the man from before. His wide-brimmed hat obscured his face, but his posture was rigid, his gaze fixed on the water. "Jake," I hissed, shaking him awake. "That guy's back." But when Jake looked, the man was gone. By dawn, we decided to cut the trip short. As we packed up, I noticed something chilling: the empty campsite was gone. No tent, no chairs, no fire pit. It was as if it had never been there. On the drive back, Jake tried to rationalize the events, but I remained silent. My mind kept returning to the notebook and the man by the lake. Who was he? And what had he been warning us about? Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the memory of that weekend. I haven't told anyone else, not even Jake, but sometimes at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I swear I hear faint whispers.
The plan was simple: spend a peaceful weekend away from the chaos of city life. I, John Carter, decided to go solo camping after hearing rave reviews about Shadow Pine National Forest, a secluded and picturesque destination. It sounded perfect, a quiet escape, with no emails or phone calls to interrupt my thoughts. I arrived late Friday evening. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the thick forest canopy blocked most of the moonlight. The gravel path crunched under my boots as I carried my gear to the designated campsite. There was no one else around, and for a moment, I felt uneasy. But I convinced myself that solitude was the whole point of this trip. Little did I know, the forest had its own plans for me. My headlamp cast a dim circle of light as I pitched my tent near the edge of the campsite. Beyond the tree line, I could hear a small creek babbling softly, a comforting sound in an otherwise silent expanse. The first night passed uneventfully. I roasted marshmallows over a small fire, scribbled thoughts into my journal, and gazed at the stars. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I heard it, a faint, almost melodic whispering. It drifted through the trees like a soft breeze, but the words were indistinguishable. I told myself it was just the wind. The next day, I explored the nearby trails. The forest was breathtaking, with towering pines and beams of sunlight filtering through the branches. But the serene atmosphere felt heavy, as if the trees were watching me. Every so often, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing. That night, the whispering returned, closer this time. I stayed inside my tent, clutching my flashlight. The words seemed clearer, though I still couldn't make sense of them. My heart raced as I realized the whispers were coming from multiple directions. The next morning, I found something strange near the edge of the creek, a circle of small, smooth stones. They hadn't been there the day before. At first, I thought it was just some hiker's creation, but the arrangement felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. That evening, the whispering grew louder. This time, it wasn't coming from the trees, it was right outside my tent. I unzipped the tent flap cautiously, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The campsite was empty, but the whispers continued, louder and more distinct. Then, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. Its silhouette was humanoid, but something was off. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, like it wasn't bound by the laws of physics. I froze as it stepped closer, its face obscured by shadows. The whispers seemed to emanate from it, a chaotic symphony of voices. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Somehow, I snapped out of my paralysis and bolted toward the trail. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic. I didn't stop until I reached the gravel parking lot, where my car was the only vehicle. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and saw the figure standing at the forest's edge, watching. Closing scene. To this day, I can still hear those whispers when I close my eyes. I don't know what I encountered in Shadow Pine, but one thing is certain, I'll never camp alone again.
The brochure described Ravenwood National Park as a hiker's paradise. My friends and I, Mia, Ethan, and I, decided to spend the weekend exploring its famed Ridgeway Trail, known for its scenic overlooks and dense forest paths. We arrived just before noon, eager to start our hike. The air was crisp, and the sky was a perfect shade of blue. The park ranger handed us a map and mentioned a curious detail: stay on the marked trails. Some of the older paths haven't been maintained for years. At the time, we laughed it off. If only we had taken his warning seriously. About 3 hours into the hike, we came across an unmarked path branching off from the main trail. It wasn't on the map, but the way the sunlight streamed through the trees made it look inviting. Against my better judgment, we decided to explore it. At first, it was beautiful, untouched nature at its finest. But as we ventured deeper, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. Even the birds had stopped chirping. Just as we were considering turning back, we stumbled upon an old wooden cabin. It looked abandoned, with its roof caved in and vines creeping up the walls. Ethan, ever the curious one, insisted on checking it out. Inside, we found rusted tools, faded photographs, and a diary. The entries spoke of strange occurrences. A family that lived there had vanished without a trace. Suddenly, Mia gasped. She pointed to the corner of the room, where a single shoe lay, muddy, but disturbingly new. We decided to leave, but the trail we came from was gone. In its place was a dense thicket of trees. Panic set in as we tried to navigate back, only to find ourselves circling back to the cabin repeatedly. As night fell, the forest seemed to close in on us. Shadows moved just beyond the edges of our flashlight beams, and distant whispers echoed through the trees. Ethan discovered strange markings carved into the trees, symbols we couldn't decipher. They seemed to form a pattern, leading us in a specific direction. With no better options, we followed them. After what felt like hours, we stumbled back onto the main trail. The moment we stepped onto the familiar path, the whispers stopped, and the air felt lighter. We reported the cabin and the symbols to the park rangers, but they only nodded solemnly. "You were not the first to find it," one of them said. "But no one knows who, or what, made those markings." That was the last time we hiked off trail.